What is special about Peter Etvös' individual voice as a composer?
I first got to know Etvös' work through recordings, and my close colleague Christoph Eschenbach had recommended his works and was so excited talking about his music that I got very interested, and that's how I actually got to first learn about Etvös' work. Very recently in Los Angeles, there was almost like a mini residency of him as a composer, and throughout the city we've heard a number of his works, including the Violin Concerto, which was premiered as part of that residency. Certainly his opera, Angels in America, was met with great enthusiasm, and it was really a very important residency, I believe, for our city. And what's very interesting about his music is that there's something very varied and at the same time very unique that makes his music identifiable as his. The sense of color, the sense of how different instruments are put together, the sonority, the flavor that comes very much from the influence of Bartók and the Hungarian school. But it's really such distinct voice that combine together to make it even more unique. So very difficult always with the best of composers, I think, to really simply describe what the characteristics are of this person's work or this person's output. But Etvös is definitely one of these composers that is just absolutely intriguing always to learn more about.
How did you first meet him?
I first met him here in Los Angeles during one of his tours, and of course by that time it was clear in my mind that I was very interested in asking whether he would consider writing a new violin concerto for me. But meeting him for the first time is always such a different experience. You get to know the person through other means first. For example, in this case, I got to know him through his music, and then actually meeting the person. Sometimes it's a surprise, and sometimes it's it's not a surprise at all. It just feels like everything fits in. I think in this case, I was really surprised, almost a little shocked by how quiet and how gentle he is, and yet very, very strong character and strong personality, very clear in what he hears, what he wants to hear, what his ideas are about, and yet also very, very open to discussing things, just exploring things together. It was a very nice meeting in the beginning, and he had already at that point, thought about what kind of thing he might want to write for me, what kind of a concerto, that it wasn't going to be for, a double orchestra or anything like that, but something with a lot of color. But at that point, he hadn't said anything about, his theme, which is DoReMi, the first three notes of a scale, that he would be utilizing this and then sort of having fun with it as a pun on my name.
How did the idea come to you of collaborating with him?
I think that because of my interest in new music, I'm always on the lookout to find for myself new sounds, new ideas, new musical expression. And so, just throughout my more recent career, I've gotten to know quite a lot of new music, quite a lot of new emerging composers, as well as established living composers. And so, as a commissioner or as somebody who plays commissioned works, I also seek for variety. So from having commissioned something by a Finnish composer, Ratavara, somebody who's American, Michael Hirsch, or Derek Bromell, or Lee Hyla, or working with Shadrin or Penderecki, just gives me a very, very interesting perspective on the contemporary music scene. Young composers, more experienced composers. But what's also interesting is that living composers, as we saw with the composers from the past, they have this very unique identity that actually keeps transforming as well. And to be sort of, so to say, real time with the progress and the development of a composer is a fascinating process.
Does meeting the composer in person give insight or clues on how you approach his music and understand his musical language?
Sometimes by working together intensely with a composer does give me very, very good and clear ideas of how I would like to play that particular piece. Sometimes it does the opposite. But I think, most of the time it gives me good ideas. But in the case of working with Eötvös, it was extremely helpful to have worked with him. And his musical knowledge, the fact that he's, of course, a great composer, but also a wonderful, wonderful musician, a composer, who is not just conducting his own works, but is really, just such a respected conductor with so much experience, and of a certain school in particular. I think just gave me a lot of different inspiration and stimulation, not just for this particular work, but for many other things. So in a very general, I think overall sense, it was a great experience to have worked with him. And specific to this piece, I think, because with any new composition, it ends up being a little bit of still work in progress during the first couple of performances. We were able to exchange ideas. I had some ideas as to maybe making what he had in mind a little bit more clearly on paper, so that from looking at the score in the future, it becomes a little bit more specific as to what he was asking for, articulations, markings, and things like that. And then just the whole flavor of the piece, I think I got so much from having worked with him. And it was so extremely helpful to have him at rehearsals and working on the balance. And it's not just me that the piece is new. It's new for everyone, for the orchestra, for the conductor, and of course that excitement and the difficulty of putting life into something that hasn't had it yet, that hasn't been heard in a concert, in a performance setting. It's a great responsibility, it's a great excitement, and we need that almost objective ear to help us to get a better perspective.
Can you speak a bit on the title of the piece?
The title of the piece was a subtitle, DoReMi. It's actually something that people more often think immediately regarding the affiliation with my name, but it's more to do with the three notes, the first three notes of a scale, of a C major scale, Do, Re, Mi, the C, D, E. And he uses this idea, the first three notes, throughout the piece. And this is what really, it's one of the things that actually ties the whole work, which is only about 20 to 23 minutes. But this idea really ties everything together. Sometimes he uses this in quarter tones, sometimes in inversions, in many different variations. And of course, the opening with a harp, it starts with a Do, Re, Mi. It was with harmonics, and of course the piece ends with it as well. But you hear it really throughout. And I think maybe the affiliation with my name, the closeness to my name is more about just having the humor with it. But it's a very serious work.
Can you explain the concerto's structure and how it differs from the classical solo concerto?
It's in 3 sections, 3 main sections. Could be considered 3 movements. It's played without a rest. It's played continuously. And the whole idea of this piece is built upon the 3 notes, C, D, and E, the DoReMi. It's fantastic to, get to know what possibilities there are from such a simple idea. I think the cadenza that comes in the final section, the final movement, extremely dramatic. I think overall it's very passionate. The second section is very folk influenced. And the very end comes this Transylvanian theme, folk, almost like a folk song, very beautiful. And to end the work this way, it's very poignant.
The concerto was written with you in mind. Can you see how that influenced the composition in any way?
Oh, I wouldn't dare to think about that. I don't know. That's a question for the composer.
Did you work together in the process? What was that exchange like? Were there many drafts and changes to the score? What were your own ideas that you offered? Or perhaps was there very little correspondence?
He was very, very kind in sending me drafts, but never in that process did I ever find anything that was unplayable. It's very difficult to play this piece, but it is well written for the violin. Difficult doesn't necessarily mean badly written. It's very well written. It's effectively written. And it's idiomatic, just very difficult. And so, there wasn't much of an exchange in that sense. Maybe there was 1 or 2 where I needed a little clarification, because in the beginning it came in a handwritten format. So it wasn't clear, the Xerox didn't come out clear. But these are minor points. It wasn't like completely reconceptualizing, a section or a phrase. A couple articulation marking things, I think I had offered some, just ideas and possibilities so that it could be notated a little bit differently, which I hope will make it more clear for other players in the future.
What does he ask of you as a soloist? Are there special or unusual techniques involved in the concerto?
Well, the piece requires a lot of concentration, a lot of energy. It's high energy, and really it has such a variety. I think of the special effects, if we were to talk about it, they're quarter tones. Not just from the solo, but from throughout the orchestra. The string section of the orchestra is rather small. It's not a huge string section, but the variety of the percussion instruments that he has, which really creates such a fabulous sonority. That is very unique. But technique-wise, it's not that he asks for, as in some of the newer works, untraditional ways of producing sound, which tapping the violin or Colegno, extreme Colegno, or putting, extra, pins and paper and coins or whatever in between strings. No, those things he doesn't do.
How do you approach a piece which is completely new to you?
How do I approach a piece that is completely new to me? It's a long process to learn a new work. And particularly, one feels such great responsibility and, of course, excitement that comes with it of being the first one to really start off the living life of this piece of music. You feel the weight of it. It's a weight that you carry on gladly, but it is not a simple task, because that life of a work starts from the first performance. First time it actually comes alive, out from the ink, so to say. And so, I don't take this responsibility lightly. I take it very seriously. It's a process. Sometimes within that process, during that process, there's work to be done with the composer. Sometimes not. It really depends on the style of the composer's type of a composition. I did ask for, in this case, for a piano reduction for the orchestra part. Although, on the piano, the type of writing that Eötvös did is very, very difficult to recreate in the piano reduction because of the harmonics of the harp and the quarter tones. Of course, quarter tones we can't do anything about, and the sounds of this concerto, particularly coming from the orchestra, isn't always totally pitch based, but it's more texture and color based, and of course the piano, to a certain extent, much more than what actually ended up being, is a very pitched instrument. You play a note, you hear that pitch, and I'm also a very pitch based player, being a violinist. So there was a difference there, but it was a very important process for me to be able to play through the concerto a few times and really learn it along with the piano reduction, because I'm not able to wait until I get to the first rehearsal with the orchestra and start knowing what else is going on, just sound-wise. Even if I study the score, it's so different when you start to actually have the sound in a tangible way around you. Again, it comes out of the mind, it comes out of the head, and when you start to have the sound surround you, it's a very different experience. And of course, the closest one can have that with would be with the piano reduction. So I think in the course of a few months, and he was very kind and very honorable in getting the score to me, the parts and the piano reduction, earlier than the deadline, which hardly ever happens with any composer, but greatly appreciated. I was able to live with a piece, even though it was not in full form of having played it with orchestra. Nobody has an orchestra to practice with, at his or her disposal. So yeah, I worked with my pianist, and she learned the part. She worked with it, patiently, and came for the rehearsals and the conductor's rehearsals and all of that. And I did sort of cold runs, cold run-throughs, trying to see how it feels like. And it's so important part of the learning process to have like a dry run of any piece. It's not just about new compositions. And so I did also for this piece. It's really not that different learning a new piece of music as one would for, say, the so-called traditional music, the process, the steps you take, the steps for preparation for a performance. So that's the way it goes.
What is it like to offer this brand new piece to an audience for the very first time? How does the experience differ from performing a more standard concerto?
It's always a thrill for me to be able to bring a piece of music to life for an audience for the first time, and bringing music that is traditional or unusual, or less popular. It doesn't really matter, but to bring music and make it come alive for the listener so that it jumps out of the page. It's something I really do love as a performer. It's something I get to do as a performer, a very important part of a practicing performer, I think, to be able to take joy in this. And particularly with a new composition, there's that added thrill of creating a new page of the listener's repertoire. Something that nobody's heard before, or maybe, in this case, I've given the premiere now, the world premiere in Los Angeles, and then we take it on to Leipzig for the European premiere, and then later on to BBC Proms. And throughout next season also I get to perform it in different parts of the world, and just being a part of that new page for the listener. It's a neat idea.
Does working on new music influence how you approach the more traditional concerto?
This season, being my 30th anniversary, has been a very interesting one. I've had some focus areas, focusing, for example, new works, commissions, new concerto like Eötvös, and then also having a focus on Bach, doing the entire set, or sort of a sub-focus also on Beethoven's, the Beethoven concerto and the sonatas, and just, I think everything influences each other. When I actually have a broader perspective, I think that I'm able to see more clearly the interconnectedness between what may seem at the beginning as very separated areas. I find something extremely modern, extremely cutting edge, so to say, in the music of Bach, and yet at the same time I find something so traditional in new music. There's definitely interconnectedness, and also having worked with new compositions, it does give me a fresh look when I go back to playing something like the Bach sonatas and partitas, which I've done for so long, almost my entire playing life I've been playing Bach. It's really an interesting sort of mixture of things that both affect each other in many different ways in both directions.
You have championed contemporary works and present them very often. Is there something in particular about playing these works that you find attractive, or that you think is important for today's audiences to hear and understand?
I think any piece of music is a reflection of the time that it was written in. And how the audience, how each listener perceives this is also greatly influenced by his or her environment, the culture, history, the background, everything. I think a piece, the reason why any particular piece, any musical work keeps changing, so to say, the notes don't change, but the piece changes. And that's because how it's understood, how it's heard, how it's interpreted, gets to be worked on. It actually keeps, going to a next phase. And it's an ongoing process. It's a process that's never going to stop. And what we hear tells us a lot more about ourselves, perhaps, than, maybe what the piece is. But then how the piece is written also is, of course, a product of its time. So there's never a moment that actually freezes and just presents that way, in the way it's interpreted and the way it's heard, and what is heard is being interpreted by the listener. So it's an ongoing, never-ending process, which I think is interesting. And as part of that, to really support music of my own time. Like we enjoy being with our peers, we enjoy being with people that we respect who are from the older generation, we also enjoy being with a younger generation, and we enjoy being with our peers of our own generation. I think it's like that also with music. We enjoy the music from the past. We enjoy the music, the contemporary. So music written, say, in the 50 years around the time you're living. And then, of course, the music that is being written now by much younger composers. So that's the future in a way. And the established living composers are the now. And then we see the future. And then we have the great history of traditional repertoire. I think it's really the combination, the variety, to make it really, we need all to make it complete.
If you could offer a piece of advice to someone who doesn't have much experience listening to contemporary music, what would that be?
I think listening to new music doesn't require anything special, so to say. We listen to music with our ears. We listen to our music and we listen to our reactions to what we hear. And that is said about every music, and not just necessarily a particular type of music. And just because we know maybe more about the structure of a certain piece doesn't make it into a better piece. It doesn't make us into better listeners. I think if we're able to just open up our ears and allow ourselves just to react and to acknowledge that, reaction. This is what music is about. It's not about knowing more about the structure or about the history of the composer or the background of the work, but it's really your own personal reaction.